It's a SuperUnited Blitz showdown. Two titans of the game collide as Fabiano Caruana, with the white pieces, takes on the one and only Magnus Carlsen. Fabi grabs the center with pawns on e4 and d4. Magnus responds with the flexible modern defense, putting his pawn on g6 and fianchettoing that powerful dark squared bishop to g7. And the plans are clear. White launches a kingside pawn storm with g4 and h4, aiming to tear open the black king's position. Magnus counters on the opposite flank, expanding with b5. White's knight hops to g3, eyeing the kingside attack, but black ignores the threat and immediately challenges on the queenside with pawn to b4. And here, white makes a crucial decision, but it's not the best one. The position is on a knife's edge, and maintaining the balance was critical. The stronger try was putting the knight right in the center. Knight to d5, knight takes the knight on d5, the pawn recaptures on d5, then pawn to s6, and pawn to h5. But in the game, Caruana pushes the pawn to g5. This is an inaccuracy that hands the advantage to black, who can now break things open with a powerful exchange on that very square, and Magnus obliges immediately. The pawn snaps off the pawn on g5, a brilliant reply from Caruana. The h-pawn takes the pawn on g5, a fantastic exchange sacrifice to rip open the h-file for his rook. Black has no choice. The rook takes the rook on h1 with check, and the bishop recaptures the rook on h1. White has given up material, but has tremendous compensation. Black plays the knight to d7, a logical developing move, but it's an inaccuracy. The critical continuation was to immediately play pawn takes pawn on c3, solidifying the queenside and cementing the advantage from the exchange. White's knight jumps to a4 to pressure the queenside. Black stakes a claim in the center with c5, and after a brief pawn shuffle, the c-pawn captures on d4. Another brilliant sacrifice from Caruana. The bishop takes the pawn on d4, a stunning move to keep the attack alive. Magnus has to accept. The bishop takes the bishop on d4, and the queen recaptures on d4. This is the only move, a fantastic find that keeps the position incredibly complex and balanced. The fight rages on. Black's knight lands on c6, and after the queen's reposition, Magnus challenges the center with pawn to e5. A flurry of trades on f4 leaves the queens eyeing each other, and here, Magnus makes a move that lets some of his hard-won advantage slip away. The position called for a different plan entirely. The stronger idea was to get the light-squared bishop involved. Bishop to a6. White's pawn takes the pawn on b4. The bishop takes the knight on e2. The king recaptures the bishop, and the pawn snaps off the pawn on b4. Instead, in the game, black's knight jumps into the center at e5. This looks active, but it gives white real counterchances, and white misses a golden opportunity. Caruana castles queenside, which is an inaccuracy. The much more dangerous move was swinging the queen over to h4, which would have put immense pressure on black's king. Now Magnus plays the move he should have played before. The bishop comes to a6, seizing the long diagonal and the initiative. White plays the knight to d4, but this is another inaccuracy that only helps black. Of course, the knight takes the knight on d4, and white must recapture. The rook takes the knight on d4. But black's advantage is now growing. Magnus has a clear edge, but finding the most precise continuation is tough in Blitz. He makes a small slip here. The most powerful move was to activate the other rook. Rook to c8. The king steps to b1, the pawn takes on a3, the queen swings to h2, and the king calmly walks to e7. Back in the actual game, black's queen slides to c7. It's a useful move, but it allows white to consolidate a little. White's queen darts to f6, creating threats. Rooks and pawns are exchanged on the queen side, and the chaos culminates with white's queen capturing the pawn on d6, daring a trade. And that's a fantastic decision. Black's queen takes the queen on d6. Magnus correctly judges that this is the only way to hold his advantage, liquidating into a winning endgame. White has no choice but to recapture with the rook on d6. And here's the key move. Black plays bishop to b5, the only way to maintain the winning edge, tying white's pieces in knots. White is forced to respond with knight to b6 to defend against the immediate threats. Magnus strikes. The rook takes the pawn on c3 with a devastating check. The white king is forced to step to b2, into even more danger. Simply stunning. Black plays rook to h3, a brilliant sacrifice to completely dismantle white's position. White takes the knight on d7, trying to untangle, but black's bishop recaptures the knight on d7, and the dust settles into a technically winning endgame. White plays the rook to d1, but it's a desperate attempt to organize a defense in a lost cause. Black brings the bishop to e6. This is still completely winning, but a small inaccuracy. The most efficient path was rook to g3, creating unstoppable threats. Now it's a matter of technique. White pushes a pawn, but black's rook checks the king, wins the pawn on a3, and the black king begins its triumphant march up to e7. White plays the rook to e1, an inaccuracy that lets black's rook become even stronger. King to d2 would have put up a much tougher fight. Black's rook takes up its dominant post on g3, and white's rook can only shuffle passively over to a1. Black pushes the pawn to a4. This doesn't spoil the win, but it's a final minor slip. The most clinical finish was bishop to b3 with check, forcing the win. White's bishop snaps off the pawn, but black's rook grabs a pawn on g5. The pieces coordinate perfectly, with king, bishop, and rook all closing the net around the exposed white king. White is in a hopeless position, and here comes the final mistake. A more resilient try was to keep the bishop active. Bishop to b5. The rook attacks on f4, the bishop slides to a6, the king marches to f5, and the bishop gives a check on c8. But instead of that, white plays the rook to f1. This move looks safe, but it walks directly into a game-ending tactic that Magnus will not miss, and there it is. The bishop lands on c4 with check, and it's all over. After the king moves, black's bishop will simply take the rook on f1, and white's position collapses entirely. What a game! A chaotic, brilliant, and topsy-turvy blitz battle ends with Magnus Carlsen converting his advantage with ruthless precision. Black wins.